Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Flying Lotus, titled You're Dead. You know, I think if I remember 2014 to anything when it comes to my music criticism career, it'll be for two things. The first, it's really turning me around on R&B. Never really a genre that I had embraced all out before, but with the rising tide of it in the mainstream and some genuinely great albums that came out this year, I've come to appreciate R&B a fair bit more. And the second thing would be my exploration of electronic music. Now, I suspect to some extent this will continue to be an ongoing process. I'm still working on getting a real grip on how to write at length about acts that don't really use a lot of lyrics, but with every single release that I cover, it's getting easier, especially when the acts have a knack for real experimentation that can drive a lot of the conversation, or they go for thematic elements that invoke discussion in their own right. So case in point, Flying Lotus, a stage name of LA producer Steven Ellison. His career originally kicked into motion with his second album, Los Angeles, in 2008, but his real success would come from the gleaming, eclectic, and generally pretty damn awesome Cosmogramma in 2010. And even coming from a guy who doesn't usually tend to love electronic music, that album gripped me immediately with its aggressively textured and detailed percussion, its masterfully layered melodies and both the synthesizers and classical instrumentation, and the off-kilter twist that suggests more than a passing influence of jazz fusion of all things. Every single listen reviewed more fascinating twists, hid moments of genuine beauty in the details, not to mention some fantastic grooves that some artists would have elongated into entire songs. It's a genuinely thrilling album to listen through, and thus, I'll admit I wasn't quite as gripped by his 2012 follow-up Until the Quiet Comes. Now that was a more restrained record with more jazzy elements and more guests, but to me it lacked some of the real flair, some of those transcendent and gorgeous moments that define Cosmogramma so effectively in contrast. Plus, the more languid pace made some of the more grating moments drag on, well, longer than they really should have. But all of that was not going to put me off checking out Flying Lotus's newest record, You're Dead. And at first glimpse, it looked like something of a completely different animal, swapping out vocals from Tom York for verses from Kendrick Lamar and Snoop Dogg. So, okay, that's interesting. What really happened here? Well, we got a pretty damn impressive album, that's for sure. Easily picking up for me after Until the Quiet Comes, Flying Lotus seems to have found that solid middle ground, at least for me, between off-kilter experimentation and smooth rhythmic jazz. And then he went above and beyond it, infused with thematic progression, which is kind of fascinating in its own right. Now, I'm not gonna say that You're Dead is without its flaws, but in terms of experimental electronic music mixed with this brand of jazz, you know what? I really like this. I really dug this album. And yet it's also the sort of record that's kind of impossible to discuss in my usual format, mostly because it's all interwoven around a very specific theme summed up in its title: death. Now, this is not the first time I've heard records about encroaching death this year, but the tone that Flying Lotus takes is decidedly different, and that it aims to capture the flurry of human emotions that might come at the sudden awareness that death is upon our protagonist, our narrator. Now, this manifests in one of the more contentious points about this album. The average track length is barely 2 minutes, which leaves many musical ideas, some of which could have carried entire full-length tracks, feeling formed but not expanded upon or fully fleshed out. Now, I'll make the argument that's the point. It's adding to the suddenness, that sense of now that really permeates this album. It's death coming, but it's with an exclamation point. So when the album begins with this massive swell of strings before breaking into an off-kilter glitchy keyboard line punctuated by horns and stuttering drums and chimes, before all breaking into the second track, Tesla, all clattering explosive percussion and fantastic bass work courtesy of Thundercat, it captures that sudden panicked urgency so well before transitioning into the angry guitars of Cold Dead, the transition from denial straight to rage. But in an odd characteristic of this album, it's not really a moment of anger that really coalesces together, because it transitions into this smooth horns line and some drifting symphonic vocals that almost seem to show our protagonist cooling off, almost with disbelief. I mean, it's not just because he was told he was gonna die, it doesn't mean it's destined to really happen. It's why Kendrick Lamar's verse on Never Catch Me works as well as it does, with the smooth pianos and bouncing clatter of drums and bass, mostly because it's such an optimistic song, a metaphorical step away from the situation to refocus and to assert what is known, and to reassess himself and his own opinions on what death could mean to him. Now, of course, the following song is Dead Man's Tetris, which is a shot of reality to the situation. All modulated chiptunes, gunfire samples, and Snoop Dogg's sly rejoinder implying that there isn't any getting away from death no matter what you think about it. It's a really odd track and not one of my favorites, full of echoing samples, and it really does completely kill the momentum of Kendrick's track. And I get the feeling it was designed precisely for that purpose. And yet the momentum kicks into high gear right right again on Turkey Dog Coma with these fuzzy guitars and incredibly tight bass coming through to balance against the eerie keys before the drum transition midway through to add another surge of energy before fading again with the inevitable knowledge that death is indeed coming. The balance between those emotions manifests most on the next track, Coronis the Terminator, which features reverse guitar leads, rain, chimes, and ghostly voices almost reminiscent of a funeral, beckoning our narrator into the cool embrace of death and the journey that might come after. Now this psychedelic vibe continues on to Siren Song. It does feature some solid guitar melodies, but the multi-track vocals courtesy of Angel Deradorian, they fall out of sync with each other a few too many times to really connect with me. In a certain way, this track and the following track, Turtles, which features a great muted bass line and eerie fluttering chimes, almost seems to call to mind the hypnotic call to death, a call for our narrator to follow the Valkyries and go quietly into that good night. And yet on this album, it doesn't happen. Ready Air Not takes the popping minor key saturated melody line and shows the glitchiness on the edges, perhaps a deception. A moment of unnecessary uncertainty when one could imagine the narrator realizing that he doesn't actually know what comes after. It might not just be a good night. There could be something darker. From there, the album gets darker and bleaker with the scratchy percussion, hazy cymbals, and chilling melody of Eyes Above. The transitions into perfectly this trembling rush of the aptly titled Moment of Hesitation, where the energy kicks back into gear thanks to fantastic drum progressions as the narrator proves that he won't die that easily. But the knowledge that death is coming anyway creeps on to Descent into Madness, and the boys that died in their sleep, complete with these off-kilter strings and subtle rumbles before breaking into these distorted high and low voices of Flying Lotus himself and his Captain Murphy persona in a genuinely unsettling moment where insanity drives him to drug overdose. Now this is arguably the weirdest moment on the album, and for my opinion, the most flawed, for two reasons. For one, even despite the distortion and the lower voice, the high vocals are distractingly bad. And then they just fade out instead of a clean transition, putting an audible break in the album's progression that really does not help here. Now thankfully, things improve considerably with a rush of theremin and strings upon obligatory cadence, punctuated by cackles and symphonic vocals, as our narrator, our protagonist, seems to realize that he's been fooled, tricked by his own mind to the slow encroach of death. Yet with the gorgeous vocals of Nikki Randa beckoning to him on Your Potential, The Beyond, with the chimes and the strings line just sounds gorgeous. It seems like some dignity after all will remain in his passage to the afterlife. And then the album ends with the Protest, a moment that might seem like a moment of plaintive anti-climax as wistful spirits say they will live on, even though this album has emphasized that we and they can't really know that. But then you realize there's a different message entirely to this album, that despite humanity's fear of death, those who live leave their touch behind forever, and thus are always felt. But it makes the tone of this album make a lot more sense, because it's not really mournful or angry, but showing acceptance of the inevitable, how that's the right thing, and implicitly telling us to live our lives to the fullest so we might leave that mark and that we might live on forever. So yeah, to make a long story short, You're Dead by Flying Lotus is fascinating, frequently gorgeous, surprisingly cohesive, and definitely thought-provoking in the questions that it raises. Now, it's not perfect. I get the feeling that Dead Man's Tetris was only written so that Flying Lotus could get Snoop Dogg on this album, and there are a few moments that it could have felt a little bit tighter, and as I said, I did not like Flying Lotus's higher vocals, but you know what? This is a damn fine album all the same that definitely deserves its 8 out of 10. Folks, if you're looking for a jazzy electronic music album that doesn't wear out its welcome and does tell a certain type of story that is really compelling, albeit a little bit thinly sketched and extrapolated by yours truly, you should definitely give You're Dead a listen. I promise you won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. So I'm curious in the comments, you guys think I'm completely full of shit going on about this album and that I extrapolate a little bit too far? What do you think it means? I'm curious for your answers here. If there's any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, or anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.